This week, what I'm going to do is just go straight into launching the video, and I'll play that. It's about 6 minutes long, and it does an excellent job of explaining everything. But after I play that video, I will spend the next 45 minutes re-explaining it, because I know this information is very challenging. I presented this actually today at work. I do a Bible study every Wednesday with a bunch of engineers, and that was interesting. They throw a lot at me, so I feel like I'm very well prepared for tonight, because they kind of put me through the ringer this afternoon when I taught this material to them. Lots of challenging questions. So I will go ahead and switch over to the video.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would again be life prohibiting. Or another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really lucky? No. the probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
All right. I don't know who does his videos, but they are amazing. I mean, the quality of the graphics they use and the way they put it together is just unbelievable. I would love to have that skill to be able to draw like that and animate like that. I mean, that is there's a very talented person working for Reasonable Faith. I'll just say that. So let's dive in. So this week we're going to look at what's commonly called the design argument. And so the first thing we need to do is define what fine tuning is. So the first thing we see are the constants of nature are fine tuned. So for those of you that don't remember algebra, I'm going to talk about what a constant is. So when the laws of nature are expressed as math equations, you find appearing in them certain symbols that stand for unchanging quantities or constants, like the force of gravity, the electromagnetic force, and the subatomic weak force. So these unchanging quantities are called constants. Now, the laws of nature themselves, which are expressed in mathematical equations, do not determine the value of these constants. So there could be universes governed by the same laws of nature, even though these constants had very different values. And you may recall from the video, they showed a couple of these equations with the constants in them. And I'll give you an example in a minute of a make-believe law of nature. So depending on the values of those constants, universes governed by the same laws of nature would look very different. The second thing that is fine-tuned are what he calls arbitrary quantities. So in addition to the constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities that are just put into these equations as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. So because these quantities are arbitrary, they're also not determined by the laws of nature. So an example of an arbitrary quantity would be the amount of thermodynamic disorder or entropy in the early universe. If you recall, last week we talked about entropy. We talked about the second law of thermodynamics. So according to the Big Bang model, we had this explosion where the universe came into being, and at that moment, there was a certain amount of entropy in the early universe, or the inverse of that would be to say there was a certain amount of energy input into the universe. And that energy is just a given in the Big Bang as an initial condition. In other words, scientists have empirical evidence. They go out and they look around the universe, they take a bunch of measurements, and they've empirically discovered through observation the values of these constants and arbitrary quantities. So if the initial quantities had been different, then the laws would predict that a quite different universe would result. So what scientists have been surprised to discover is that these constants and quantities must fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of values for the universe to be life permitting. This is what is meant by the fine tuning of the universe for life. Now, about 10 years ago, there were roughly 20 of these constants and quantities that physicists had discovered that are finely tuned. Today, I think it's probably more like 30 or 40, because every year physicists are discovering new constants and quantities that are finely tuned. So this argument keeps getting stronger every year. The further we go into the future, the stronger this argument gets. We're just finding more and more and more fine tuning. We're finding more and more constants and quantities that have to be fine tuned for life to exist. So here's a make-believe law of nature. So this is just an equation I made up. But, this is how physicists describe the laws of nature. It's basically algebraic equations. So when we're talking about constants and quantities, so a constant would be like the number 100 would be a constant. And then the number 57 would be an initial condition. So in these equations, you have this law of nature, right? You have these numbers which are arrived at by empirical observation. In this case, 157. And again, this is just made up. It's just an example to show you what we're talking about when we talk about constants and quantities. So another way to view this is, imagine we did have a universe creating machine. So each one of these descriptions over here would be a single constant or quantity. So on this universe creating machine, we have what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So there's only 9 here. In reality, like I said, there's more like 30. But the idea is that each one of these constants or quantities is finely tuned, right, by these little dials. So you have to spin these dials exactly correct for life to exist in the universe. And each one of these has to be precisely dialed in for life to exist. If even one of these dials is off by a tiny, tiny amount, then we literally could have no life in the universe at all. So the numbers in the video were pretty huge, and they're pretty hard to imagine. But what I want to do is offer some context to let you know just how big these numbers are. So the number of seconds in the entire history of the universe is around 10 to the 17th power. So again, for those of you that don't remember exponents, that means a 1 followed by 17 zeros. Right? So it's a really big number. And that's the number of seconds in the entire history of the universe. physicists estimate that the number of subatomic particles in the entire known universe is said to be around 10 to the 80th power, or 1 followed by 80 zeros. That's how many subatomic particles they believe exist in the entire universe. So those are outrageously large numbers. I mean, we can't really wrap our minds around them. But I'm just trying to give you some context when I show you these examples of fine tuning, to think, in fact, one of the engineers today, I had about 8 of them today I was presenting this to, and one of them was saying, oh, I would think that these constants, if they're plus or minus 10%, the universe could easily permit life. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. You don't understand how small these numbers are and how finely tuned this has to be. So when I went through this with him, he finally understood it. So I just have a few examples of fine tuning. The weak force is the first one. So the so-called weak force, which is one of the 4 fundamental forces of nature. So physicists tell us there's 4 fundamental forces of nature. There's the weak force, the strong force, the electromagnetic force, and the gravitational force. So the weak force operates inside the nucleus of an atom. And this constant is so finely tuned that an alteration in its value by even 1 part out of 10 to the 100th power would prevent a life-permitting universe. So 1 followed by 100 zeros. That is how finely tuned the atomic weak force is, which is, again, one of the 4 fundamental laws of nature. So, I mean, this number is inconceivably large. And so the odds of this just being that value by accident are insanely low. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. The cosmological constant. So a change in the so-called cosmological constant, which drives the acceleration of the universe's expansion by as little as 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, would have rendered the universe life prohibiting. So if you recall from last week, we talked about the fact that the universe, the space in the universe is expanding. The universe is getting bigger every day. And actually, that expansion is accelerating. So the universe is getting bigger at a higher and higher rate every day. And this cosmological constant is part of that equation. So if you change that number by 10 to the 120th power, the universe would literally collapse in on itself, and we would have no life. And the final example is the low entropy initial condition. So Roger Penrose of Oxford has calculated that the odds of the low entropy state at the beginning of the universe, and that just means the amount of energy that was put into the initial universe, into the Big Bang, that if you change that number on the order of 1 unit out of 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power, a number that is so inconceivable that to call it astronomical would be a wild understatement, we could not have a life-permitting universe, right? So here we have 2 exponents, right? We have 10 to the 10th power, and then you take that to the power of 123. I don't even know how many zeros that is. It's a lot of zeros. And so you can just go on and on with these examples. Now, some of the constants and quantities are not as finely tuned as these numbers. Like, I'm giving you examples of the higher ones, the ones that are really finely tuned. Some of the other ones are less finely tuned than this, but nevertheless, it doesn't matter because the point still holds. Because remember, all of these constants and quantities have to be finely tuned for life to exist, not just one of them or 2 of them. They all have to be finely tuned. So one counter argument you might hear is from a skeptic is, but if the constants and quantities had different values, then maybe different forms of life might have evolved. I mean, we only know the life that we see here on Earth. Maybe if you change these constants and quantities, we could have, had other kinds of life in the universe. Well, when scientists say a universe is life permitting, they're not talking about just present forms of life. By life, scientists basically mean the property of an organism to take in food, extract energy from it, grow, adapt to the environment, and reproduce. So very basic. I mean, this is extremely simple life forms. Anything that can fulfill those functions counts as life, whatever form it might take. So the argument is not that we require fine tuning for human beings to exist. We're saying we require fine tuning for any basic definition of life to exist. And in order for life so defined to exist, the constants and quantities of the universe have to be unbelievably fine tuned. In the absence of fine tuning, not even matter, not even chemistry would exist, much less planets where life might evolve. So without this fine tuning, you have no stars, you have no galaxies, you have no periodic chart. I mean, you might have hydrogen and a couple other elements, but there's no possibility for anything life permitting to exist. So that argument doesn't fly. So now that we've talked about fine tuning, here's the argument. Premise one: the fine tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise two: it is not due to physical necessity or chance. Premise three: therefore, it is due to design. Very simple. So all we have to do is show that the fine tuning, which all physicists agree there's fine tuning. They all agree. This is not disputed. Again, one of the questions I had today is one of the engineers said, well, how do I know this isn't just a Christian making all this up? And, this fine tuning sounds pretty crazy to me. I've never heard of this before. And I'm like, you don't have to believe me. You could go look this up, go on Wikipedia, go on the internet, go buy a book. The fine tuning is not disputed. Physicists, if you saw in the video, there were all kinds of quotes from different physicists, and most of those physicists are atheists or agnostics. So those were not Christian physicists. So fine tuning is not disputed by physicists. So the three explanations are physical necessity, or the three possible explanations for fine tuning are: first, physical necessity, which that basically says that the constants and quantities must have the values that they do. In other words, it's impossible for the constants and quantities to not be life permitting. The second explanation, which is really the popular alternative to design, I haven't seen anybody in the literature or in the past 10, 15 years who really defends physical necessity. I mean, maybe they're out there, but I don't see it very much. Most of them try to defend this one, that we just got lucky. And then the third option is design. The constants and quantities were designed to have the values they do. So let's look at the first premise. So the first premise just says that the fine tuning is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. And this is unobjectionable. And Bill Craig says, if anybody wants to add a fourth option, fine. If you could think of another option for the fine tuning, you can throw that on the pile and people will deal with it. But in the debates I've seen and in the reading I've done, I've never seen a third option offered. It's always one of these three. And most of the time it's chance is the option that's offered. or at least by people that don't want to believe in God. So according to the first alternative, physical necessity, the universe has to be life permitting. The constants and quantities must have the values they do so that a life prohibiting universe is physically impossible. But this alternative seems fantastically implausible. Why take such a radical view? The constants are not determined by the laws of nature. Remember, these constants are arrived at by empirical observation. So it's scientists taking measurements. That's how the constants are arrived at. So the laws of nature do not determine these values. So why couldn't they be different? Moreover, the arbitrary quantities are just boundary conditions on which the laws of nature operate. Nothing seems to make them necessary. So the opponent of design is taking a radical line that requires some proof, but there is none. The guys I talked to this morning or this afternoon all said, this is a crazy option. Like, nobody's going to make this argument. You know, physical necessity seems ridiculous. Why are you even talking about it? I'm like, well, you know, I'm just going through the argument as it was presented in the book. I agree. It seems pretty far-fetched. So that leads to the second alternative. Could the fine-tuning be due simply to chance? So according to this alternative, it's just an accident that all the constants and quantities fell into the life permitting range. We basically just lucked out. But the fundamental problem here is that the chances that the universe should happen to be life permitting are so remote that this alternative becomes totally unreasonable. So there's Leo. He had to make an appearance. So Leo says, I was designed by breeders who mixed Cavalier Spaniels with Poodles and Bichons. So he was definitely designed. He did not arrive by physical necessity and definitely not by chance based on the price tag I had to pay for him. So this is a dog that was designed. And, you know, as human beings, we can figure out when things are designed pretty easily. I mean, we do it every single day. That's what, you know, archaeologists do it, cryptographers do it. There's all the SETI project, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They are listening to radio waves from outer space, and the way that they claim they're going to detect if it's an alien is if they send like prime numbers or, you know, some kind of math equation or something. They will know that the message was designed by an intelligence. So anyway, there's Leo. All right, so here's a thought experiment. Let's adjust each constant and quantity or initial condition, and then assess whether the adjustment yields a life-permitting universe or a life-prohibiting universe. So if we get a life-permitting universe, we'll color a dot red, and if it prohibits life, we'll color it black. And so here's what we're doing, right? Or at least in the thought experiment. We're going to modify these numbers, and we're going to see, do we get a life-permitting universe or a life-prohibiting universe? So there's our life-permitting universe, which is ours, which is fine-tuned. Now we're going to start adjusting the knobs. Here's what happens. We get a bunch of life-prohibiting, more life-prohibiting, more. Every single dial that I turn, I get a life-prohibiting universe. I mean, we have one little dot of red surrounded by a sea of black dots, meaning every time we adjust any of those dials on that universe creating machine, we mess it up. We get a universe where life cannot exist. And of course, if I could draw, 10 to the 180th power dots, that would be more realistic. But I kind of got tired after I drew 100. So you'll just have to, work with me here. Now, some opponents of the design argument will argue that fine-tuning is like winning the lottery. So they appeal to the example of a lottery in order to justify the chance alternative. And here's their argument. In a lottery where all the tickets are sold, it's fantastically improbable that any one person should win, yet somebody has to win, right? It's a lottery. Somebody has to win. In fact, didn't somebody win the Powerball lottery a few days ago? I can't remember. But somebody did. So the winner of the lottery would never say that the people behind the lottery designed the lottery for him to win. He would say that somebody had to win and he was just the lucky one. It was chance. In the same way, they argue, some universe out of the range of possible universes has to exist. The winner of the universe lottery would be unjustified to think that because his universe exists, this must have been the result of design, not chance. All the universes are equally improbable, but one of them by chance has to win. So that's an argument a skeptic might make. Now, what's wrong with that argument? Is that really a good analogy of fine tuning? And I think it clearly is not. So let's see why it's not a good analogy. The correct analogy would be a lottery in which billions and billions and billions of white ping pong balls were mixed together with just one red ping pong ball. And you were told that one ball will be randomly selected. If it's red, you'll be allowed to live. If it's white, you'll be executed. You'll be shot. So you're really hoping to get the red one. But there's billions and billions of white ones. So this is an illustration from the book. You can see the one tiny red dot in the middle in a sea of white ping pong balls. And somehow the only way you're going to live is when this, giant ball is mixed up, that red one somehow comes out of it. Now, notice that any particular ball out of the billions and billions that is randomly selected is equally improbable. So no matter which ball rolls down the chute, the odds against that particular ball are fantastically improbable. But some ball will roll down the chute. This is the point illustrated or the argument made by the lottery analogy. But that point, however, hopefully you can see, is totally irrelevant because we're not trying to explain why any particular ball was picked. The crucial point is that whichever ball rolls down the chute, it is overwhelmingly more probable that it will be white rather than red. So getting the red ball is no more improbable than getting any particular white ball, but it is incomprehensibly more probable that you will get a white ball instead of a red ball. So if the red ball rolls down the chute, you certainly should suspect that the lottery was designed to let you live. And I think any sane, rational person, if that happened, would say, yeah, this was rigged. Somebody designed or somebody intended for that red ball to roll down the chute because there's no way that red ball should have rolled down the chute when there were billions and billions and billions of white balls. So this is the correct analogy or comparison to a lottery. So what is our conclusion? The conclusion is because physical necessity and chance do not explain fine-tuning, then it is the result of design. And obviously design only comes from a designer. Now, in the book, Bill Craig talks about Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous atheist in the world today. He has a really big mouth. He's constantly tweeting. He writes books. He's in the news all the time, talking about how ridiculous religious people are and how it's completely obvious that God doesn't exist. And Richard Dawkins has all kinds of atheist fanboys that follow his every word and hang on everything he says. So Dawkins says that this argument proves nothing because it doesn't answer the question, who designed the designer? And if we can't explain who designed the designer, then, we don't have an explanation for the design. That's his argument. So this claim is flawed on at least two counts. First, in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. And I think this is obvious if you think about it. This is an elementary point in the philosophy of science. So take, for example, this arrowhead here. Imagine if you were an archaeologist and you discovered something that looks like an arrowhead. You would be justified in concluding that this artifact is not the chance result of sedimentation and metamorphosis, but it's a design of some unknown group of people, even though we don't know who the group of people were, right? So if you're an archaeologist and you discover an arrowhead, it's perfectly reasonable for you to say, somebody designed that arrowhead. A person produced that arrowhead. It would be crazy for you to say, well, I can't tell you exactly the name of the person that made the arrowhead. I don't know how old they are. I don't know their genealogy. I don't know what color skin they have. So I guess I can't say a person designed the arrowhead. I mean, that would be crazy. So we don't need an explanation of the explanation. In fact, think about it. If we needed an explanation for every scientific cause that we put forward, we could never get anywhere with science. We could never draw any conclusions about causes of anything because we would have to keep going backwards. Well, what was the cause? What was the explanation of that? Well, what was the explanation of that? Second, Dawkins thinks that in the case of a divine designer of the universe, the designer is just as complex as the universe or the thing to be explained, so that no explanatory advance is made. But he doesn't understand Christian theology at all. So his fundamental mistake lies in his assumption that a divine designer is just as complex as the universe, but that is plainly false. As a pure mind without a body, God is a remarkably simple entity. And by simple, I obviously don't mean lacking intelligence, right? This is a technical term that philosophers use. Simple means not composed of parts. That's all it means. So God is not composed of parts. You cannot take God and chop him into pieces. You can't divide God up. You can't take pieces of God and separate him. You can't cut him in half. God is a simple being. He is not composed of parts. And, Jewish and Christian and Muslim theologians have held this view for thousands of years. So they've always held, if you take a systematic theology class ever, if any of you get a chance to do that, you'll study the attributes of God. And one of the first attributes you're taught is that God is simple. He is not composed of parts. So a mind is not a physical object composed of parts. And certainly such a mind may have complex ideas, but the mind itself is a remarkably simple spiritual entity. So that's it for the presentation. So now we'll get to some questions. And obviously for next week, read chapter 6, which I believe is going to be on the moral argument. For God's existence. Is that right? Okay, I think that's what it is. But let me stop. Any comments, questions? All right, well, let me close this in prayer and we will be done. So go ahead and read chapter 6. Chapter 6 is totally different from the last 3 chapters. For any of you that have read it or haven't read it, you know, the last 3 chapters have been about, you know, the Big Bang and the cause of the universe and fine tuning and science and blah, blah, blah. Well, next week is going to be the argument from morality, or the moral argument for God's existence, which is personally my favorite of all of them. But, you know, the ones we've learned so far are great too, but I really like the moral argument. And if you've never read C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, the first half of that book is basically the moral argument. And if you haven't read Mere Christianity, I beg you, please go buy it and read it. It's one of the most fantastic books written by a Christian ever. It is really, really good. And C.S. Lewis is an outstanding writer. He's very witty and humorous, and you will just be flying through the pages because he is such a good writer. Okay, let me close in prayer. Father, thank you again for all of the evidence you've given us about your creative ability, your intelligence, your power, the fact that you literally fine-tuned our universe to such an amazing degree. I mean, Father, as we look up to the stars and we see this vast universe with the trillions of stars and galaxies and planets, is just incredible. And I don't understand how people can say there's no evidence. Father, I just thank you that you've opened our eyes to this, that you've shown us who you are, and you've shown us how powerful you are. And we thank you for the fine tuning of the universe that allowed us to arrive, allowed us to be here to worship you and just try to bring you glory. It's in your Son, Jesus' name I pray. Amen. See you next week.
Thanks, Billy.
Thank you.
Thanks, Billy.